She was going to die in this hall. Senna knew it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has done anything to prove it. Something in the air, something in the stillness of the men around her, something in the way the Alpha King had not looked at her once since she had been dragged in through the iron doors and thrown to her knees on the stone floor. He sat on his throne of black antler and dark oak at the far end of the hall, one elbow on the armrest, one hand covering the lower half of his face, and he looked at the wall above her head with the flat, unhurried patience of a man waiting for something boring to finish. That was the part that scared her most, not the anger, the boredom. The great hall of Varek Moor smelled of blood and tallow candles and the particular damp animal warmth of too many wolves in an enclosed space. It was enormous. Vaulted stone ceiling, timber pillars as wide as old oaks, iron sconces along every wall throwing unsteady amber light across the faces of the pack members ranked on both sides of her. 100 wolves, maybe more, all watching, all silent. Senna kept her chin up. She had decided, somewhere between being thrown over a horse 3 days ago and being dragged through these doors tonight, that she was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break before they had even started. She was a blood reader's daughter, born in the hill settlements east of the Greywood, and blood readers did not kneel easily. She was kneeling now, admittedly, but she was kneeling like she had chosen to. The beta stepped forward from the left side of the throne. A broad, cold-eyed woman named Vara, faced with gray streaking her dark hair and the expression of someone who has processed a great many problems and found them all equally tiresome. She unrolled a piece of parchment with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times and expects to do it many more. Senna of the Greywood Hill Settlements. She read, without inflection, without interest. Captured in the sovereign territory of the Varek Moor pack. Third trespass in 14 months. In violation of the pack accords of the Broken Moon. Sentence to be determined by the Alpha King. Silence. The Alpha King, Aldric, 26 years old, ruler of the largest and most feared pack in the Northern Territories, with a scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his jaw and eyes the color of winter ice, finally looked at her. His gaze was not cruel. That was the thing about Aldric that everyone who had ever faced him in this hall remarked upon afterward, assuming they were in a condition to remark upon anything. His gaze was not cruel. It was simply absent of anything that might complicate the business of ruling. No warmth, no curiosity, no mercy, but no pleasure in the lack of it either. Just assessment. The way you look at a problem you need to solve before moving on to the next one. Third trespass, he said. His voice was low and even. What were you looking for? Senna said nothing. Something moved in his eyes. Not anger, not interest, just a slight recalibration. You'll answer or you won't, and the sentence is the same either way. I'm asking because I'm curious, not because it changes anything. The Greywood is dying, Senna said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. The game has moved east, into your territory. My people are hungry. I came to trap, not to challenge. 3 times, Vara said flatly from beside the throne. 3 times, Senna agreed. Because the first 2 times I came back empty-handed and my people were still hungry. A sound moved through the hall, not quite a murmur, not quite silence. Aldric looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the wall above her head, and she understood that the conversation was over and the deliberation had begun, and she was no longer a person in this room, but a problem being weighed. She looked at her hands on the cold stone floor. Her mother's ring was still on her right hand, a narrow band of dark iron set with a chip of something that looked like bone but wasn't. New carved with the symbol Senna had never been able to identify. Her mother had worn it every day of her life and had given it to Senna on the morning she died and had said very quietly, as though she was not sure she should be saying it at all, "Keep this on your hand. Whatever happens, whatever they tell you, keep this on your hand." Senna had kept it on her hand for 11 years without knowing why. She was looking at it now, at the carved symbol catching the tallow light, when she heard Aldric begin to speak the sentence. He said, "Exile, permanent. From the Northern Territories, the Eastern Ridge, and the Greywood settlements. If she is found in Pack territory again." And then something happened that Senna did not plan, did not decide, did not understand. The symbol on her mother's ring began to glow, not brightly, not dramatically. Just a faint, cold, silver light, the color of moonlight on still water, that spread from the carved mark up through the iron band and onto the skin of her finger. And then, before she could close her hand or hide it or understand what was happening, up through her palm and her wrist and into her blood like something waking up after a very long sleep. And out of her mouth, in a voice that was hers, but deeper than hers, older than hers, came a single word she had never spoken before in her life. Varek. The hall went absolutely silent. Not the silence of before, the comfortable, patient silence of a pack watching a sentencing. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that happens when every person in a room simultaneously understands that something has occurred that none of them have the framework to process. While Aldric had stopped speaking mid-sentence, he was looking at her hand, at the ring, at the silver light that was already fading, already retreating back into the iron, already becoming just a ring again, but had been for 3 seconds unmistakably, undeniably real. Senna looked at her own hand as though it belonged to someone else. "Where did you get that ring?" Aldric said. It was not a question. It had the flat, careful quality of a man keeping his voice controlled by conscious effort. "My mother," Senna said. "Her name. Dara. Dara of the Greywood Hills. She was a blood reader. She died 11 years ago." Something crossed Aldric's face, there and gone, so fast she might have imagined it. He stood up from the throne. He was taller than she expected. And the scar on his face caught the torchlight as he descended the 2 steps from the dais and walked toward her across the stone floor. And every wolf in the hall watched him in the particular frozen way of people witnessing something that has not happened before and are not sure what it means. He stopped in front of her, crouched down, not to diminish himself but to bring himself level with her, close enough that she could see his eyes properly for the first time. Winter ice, she had thought. But up close they were more complicated than that. There were threads of silver in them, very faint, the same silver as the light that had come from her ring. He reached out and took her hand before she could pull it back, turned it over, looked at the ring. His jaw was tight. "Stand up," he said quietly. Senna stood up. Her knees protested. She ignored them. "Vera," Aldric said without looking away from the ring. "Clear the hall." The beta stared at him. "My king, clear it." The hall emptied. It took less than 2 minutes. 100 wolves, gone, filing out through the side doors with the well-trained efficiency of people who have learned not to question that particular tone. Vara was the last to go, and she went slowly, and she looked back once from the doorway with an expression that had complicated things in it that Senna did not have the context to read. The iron doors closed. In the empty hall, in the tallow light, Aldric let go of her hand and stepped back. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he had not looked before, with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite recognition, but lived in the territory between them. "My mother's name was Saren," he said. "She died when I was 4. She was not from any pack. She came from the old settlements, the hill country east of the Greywood, which no longer exists because the pack wars burned it to the ground 30 years ago." He paused. "She wore a ring exactly like that one. I have not seen that symbol in 22 years. Senna looked at him. "What is the symbol?" "It is the mark of the Varek bloodline," he said. "The original Varek, not the pack, the bloodline the pack was named for. The first blood, the line that existed before packs, before territories, before the Accords, the line that was supposed to have died out 3 generations ago." He stopped. His voice had remained even throughout all of this, but there was something happening underneath it. Something pressurized and carefully managed. Like it did not die out. "No," Senna said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one colder than the last. "It didn't." She thought about her mother, about the ring, about the word that had come out of her mouth in a voice that was not entirely hers. About the silver light, about the particular way her mother had sometimes gone very still when she thought no one was watching, as though she was listening to something that existed just below the frequency of ordinary sound. She thought about the fact that she had come to Varek Moor 3 times, not because the game had moved east, because something had been pulling her here. Something she had named hunger because hunger was a reason she understood, but which had never entirely felt like hunger. Aid had always felt like something older and more directional than that. A compass needle swinging toward a fixed point, patient and certain and not especially interested in her opinion about it. "We are related," she said, not a question. "I don't know what we are," Aldric said. "But that symbol does not appear on 2 rings by accident." He looked at her with those complicated silver-threaded eyes. "There is a place. 3 days north, into the high country, past the Greywood border. My mother spoke of it once when I was very small. I did not understand it then. She called it the seat of first blood, a place where the original Varek line made their oaths, where the bloodline can be confirmed or denied." He paused. "I have never gone. I told myself it was because I had a pack to run and no time for old stories." Another pause, shorter. One more honest. "I did not go because I was afraid of what I would find." Senna looked at him. This alpha king who had been about to exile her 30 minutes ago, who held the lives of the largest pack in the Northern Territories in his hands, who had a scar on his face from a war she only knew about from the outside, who was standing in an empty hall with a blood reader's daughter from the hill settlements and admitting, quietly, to being afraid. "And now," she said. "Now there are 2 rings," he said. And the word was spoken, which has not happened in this hall in living memory. He looked at her steadily. "I think we need to go." Senna thought about her people, the hunger, the dying game. She thought about the ring on her hand and the word in her blood and the thing that had been pulling her east for 3 years. "I think so too," she said. "They left before dawn. Aldric told Vara they were riding the northern border. A routine patrol, nothing that required escort." Vara looked at him the way she always looked at him when he was doing something she considered operationally inadvisable, which was a look she had been perfecting for the 6 years of his reign, and said nothing, which was how Senna understood that the beta was far more intelligent than she appeared, and had already decided that whatever was happening was above the level of intervention. They rode north as the sky went from black to the particular dark blue that precedes dawn, through through the outer settlements of Varek Moor and into the wild country beyond, where the trees grew old and enormous and the path became suggestion rather than fact. Aldric rode without speaking. Senna rode without speaking. They were not comfortable together. There was too much between them for comfort, too much that had not been named yet, too much that the naming of might change everything. But they were not uncomfortable in the way of strangers. They were uncomfortable in the way of people who know, instinctively, that they are connected by something they do not yet understand, and are not sure whether that connection is gift or burden. On the first night, they camped in the shelter of a rock formation that blocked the northern wind. Aldric built the fire with the competent, unsentimental efficiency of a man who has spent a great deal of time outdoors and has no romantic feelings about it. Senna unwrapped the provision pack one of his stable hands had pressed into her arms as they left. It's with the particular expression of someone who had been told this was not happening and had chosen to assist anyway. "How did you get the scar?" she said. Not because she needed to know, because the silence had reached the point where breaking it was less uncomfortable than maintaining it. Aldric looked at her across the fire. "The Iron Shore War. 4 years ago. You were 22. I had been Alpha for 2 years. The Iron Shore Pack crossed the eastern boundary and burned 3 settlements. I went to meet their Alpha personally." He touched the scar without seeming to realize he was doing it. The automatic, unconscious gesture of someone revisiting something they have made their peace with. "He was better than me. I won anyway." "How?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent. I was angrier." Senna looked at him across the fire. In the firelight, without the throne and the hall and the 100 wolves and the weight of the sentencing, he looked younger. Not young. There was nothing young about his eyes, but younger than the version of him she had been dragged before 3 hours after arriving in Varek Moor. More like a person and less like a function. "My mother used to say," she said slowly, "that the blood knows before the mind does. That the body carries information the conscious self hasn't been given access to yet." She looked at her ring. I always thought she meant blood reading, the work. I think now she meant something else. "The first blood," Aldric said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted. An ember popped and threw a brief cascade of sparks into the dark air above them. My mother used to go still," he said, completely still, as though she was listening. I asked her once what she was listening to, and she said, "The old ones." I thought she meant the dead. I think now she meant the bloodline. Senna stared at him. My mother did the same thing. They looked at each other across the fire, and in the look was the particular recognition of 2 people who have grown up carrying the same unexplained thing and have just, for the first time, met someone else who knows what it weighs. They reached the high country on the 3rd day. The seat of first blood was not what Senna had expected, though she could not have said what she had expected. It was a stone. A single standing stone, taller than a man, narrow and dark, and set into the hillside at the edge of a clearing where the trees had pulled back in a perfect circle as though they had been asked to make room. The stone was old in a way that bypassed the word old and became something else, something that made the air around it feel thicker, as though time moved differently within the circle of trees. Carved into its face, from top to bottom, were marks she recognized. The same mark as her ring, repeated over and over in columns so precise they might have been made yesterday. The ground around the stone was covered in silver moss that had not been there when they entered the clearing. She was certain of that. certain enough to stop walking and look at it with the specific attention of someone whose mother taught her to notice what changes. Aldric stopped beside her. Oh, he was looking at the stone with the expression of a man who has been expecting something for a long time and is now encountering the reality of it and finding that expectation and reality are not the same thing. Together, Senna said. They walked to the stone together. She put her right hand against it, the hand with the ring, and Aldric put his left hand beside hers, and the moment both their palms touched the stone, the carved marks began to do what the mark on her ring had done in the hall. That cold, silver light spreading outward from their hands in both directions, moving up through the columns of marks until the entire face of the stone was illuminated. And in the illumination was not just light, but information. The way of fire is not just warmth, but also what it burns, what it was made of, what it will leave when it is done. Aunt Senna felt it come into her like a river finding its course. She saw her mother, Dara, younger than Senna had ever seen her, standing in a place that looked like this clearing before the stone was raised, speaking with a woman Senna did not recognize. The woman had Aldric's jaw and her mother's hands and silver-threaded eyes, and she was saying something Senna could not hear but could understand anyway, the way you understand things in dreams. That the bloodline had split, 2 daughters of the first blood going 2 separate ways into the world, carrying the mark and the word and the old power in their blood, carrying it into hiding because the pack wars were coming, and the first blood had always been the thing the packs feared most and would destroy if they found it. 2 sisters, hiding separately, never speaking of it, never finding each other again. And their children, finding each other by the pull of the blood 3 generations later, in a hall that smelled of tallow and judgment. Senna came back to herself. She was still standing at the stone, her hand still pressed to the cold carved surface. And Aldric was beside her, and he had come back too. She could tell by the particular stillness of someone processing something enormous. And the silver light was fading, retreating, the marks going dark, 1 column at a time. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her already. His expression had done something she had not seen it do before, had opened slightly, in the way of someone who has been holding something braced against pressure for a very long time and has just been relieved of the need. "Cousins," he said. "Cousins," she agreed. A silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, not the weighted kind. The kind that comes after something large has been confirmed and the world has not ended, which is its own form of relief. The bloodline splits power. Aldric said slowly, working it out as he spoke. Your line carries the voice, the word, the command, the thing that stopped the hall. My line carries... He paused. The other thing. The governance. The sword. Your mother's line was meant to hold the territories, Senna said, understanding arriving fully now. Keep the packs from destroying each other. Keep the borders. My mother's line was meant to hold the bloodline itself, the memory, the word, the way back in. And neither line was ever supposed to stay hidden, Aldric said. They were supposed to find each other. Senna thought about 3 trespasses. Was about hunger that was not entirely hunger. About a ring on her hand for 11 years and a word in her blood she had never spoken. They did, she said. The ride back south took 2 days. They talked more, not about the stone or the bloodline or the weight of what it meant, but about smaller things that built toward the larger thing the way smaller stones build a foundation. His pack, her people, the Iron Shore War, the blood reading, which he asked about with genuine curiosity, which surprised her, the way the hill settlements had been before the pack wars pushed them into poverty. The way Varek Moor had been before he took the throne at 20, which had been too young, and he knew it and had never said so to anyone before. They were different. That was real, and she did not pretend otherwise. What, he was a ruler, and she was a hill settlement woman with a mother's ring and no title and no territory and nothing that the world of packs recognized as power. He was accustomed to being obeyed. She was accustomed to being invisible. He thought in terms of strategy and consequence. She thought in terms of people and need. They would disagree. They would disagree often and probably loudly, if what she had seen of him so far was any indication, and what he had seen of her. But the blood did not lie. The stone had confirmed it, and beneath the differences, beneath the ruler and the hill woman and the scar and the ring and everything that had made them strangers an hour before she was dragged through those iron doors, there was the same thing running through both of them, the same old patient, a silver-threaded thing that had been waiting 3 generations for them to find each other. They entered Varek Moor at dusk on the 5th day. Vara was waiting at the gate. Of course she was, with the expression of a woman who had spent 5 days preparing for several different versions of this conversation and was now selecting the appropriate one. Aldric dismounted, looked at his beta. "Prepare the council chamber," he said, "and send word to the hill settlements east of the Greywood. Tell them their people are invited to winter in Varek Moor territory, full hunting rights, full protection of the pack accords." Vara stared at him. Then she looked at Senna, then back at Aldric. "Is there something I should know?" she said. "Yes," Aldric said, "but the council chamber first." Vara went. Senna stood in the gateway of Varek Moor as the torches were lit against the coming dark, and she looked at the pack moving around her. The people of this place, going about the end of their day, ordinary and alive and entirely unaware of what had just shifted in the architecture of their world. Aldric stood beside her. "The Iron Shore Alpha has been pushing the western boundary for 2 years, he said. "Not hard enough to be a formal challenge, hard enough to be a message." "What is the message?" "That he does not believe the Varek Moor pack is what it used to be, that he is testing for weakness." He paused. "The word you spoke in the hall, Varek. It is not just the name of the pack. In the old tongue, in the first blood language, it means united, the one that holds." He looked at her. No alpha of this pack has been able to speak it since the first blood died out. The hall heard you speak it. By tomorrow morning, every pack in the Northern Territories will have heard that someone spoke it in the Varek Moor Hall. Senna understood what he was saying. They will want to know who. They will want to know what it means, what is coming. His winter ice eyes, with their silver threads, held hers steadily. "What is coming?" Senna looked out at the torchlit gate, at the pack settling into evening, at the dark country beyond the walls where other packs were moving, testing boundaries, waiting for weakness. She thought about her mother going still and listening to something that lived below ordinary sound. She thought about the ring on her hand and the word in her blood and the stone in the high country with its silver light. She thought about 3 generations of hiding, of splitting, of carrying something ancient and necessary in secret because the world was not ready for it. She thought about whether the world was ready for it now. She decided that was the wrong question. The right question was whether the world needed it now. And the answer to that was written in every burned settlement and broken accord and tested boundary in the Northern Territories. Something old, she said. Something they forgot existed. She turned to look at him. Something that is going to ask them to stop the war. "They won't want to," Aldric said. "No," she agreed. They won't. She looked at the ring on her hand, the iron band, the carved mark. Dark and quiet now, but carrying everything it had always carried, waiting as it had always waited. That's why there are two of us. Aldric looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had been dragged through his iron doors, he nodded. Not the nod of an alpha acknowledging a subordinate, but the nod of one person acknowledging another as an equal. As kin. As the other half of something that had been incomplete for 3 generations and was, as of 5 days ago in a clearing in the high country, complete at last. "The council chamber," he said. "The council chamber," she agreed. They walked in through the gate of Varek Moor together as the last light of the day went out above the northern territories, and somewhere in the high country 3 days north, in a clearing where the trees had made room, a standing stone stood dark and carved and patient in the silver moss. Its work, for now, done.